Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from The Black Dog, Other Like Me. Boy, talk about a lot of new releases all coming out together pretty much at the same time. Got new Ski Mask music and Moby to cover in the near future. But before we get to those, we've got another new Black Dog album to talk about. Obviously, this long-running Sheffield techno outfit has been pretty damn prolific as of late. Over the course of last year, they released 3 entire new studio albums in Music for Airport Lounges, The Grey Album, and My Brutal Life. I've done videos on all of those, links in the description. And the latter of those 3 was also an honorable mention for one of my favorite albums of 2023. And it seems they haven't been slowing down either. We've already got another new album here, their 19th main album to date. Only about 8 or 9 months after the last one, and after a nice remastering of my personal favorite out of all their albums, Silenced, back in April. So on this newest album, it seems the theme they've decided to focus on is mental health, titled after a quote of an interview from Kosi Fanny Tootie. Included in the Bandcamp download is a PDF booklet that features an introductory passage from Martin Dust explaining the inspiration behind this album, in which he talks about his own struggles with debilitating OCD, imposter syndrome, social isolation, and even self-harm, as well as the contradictions between his own self-doubt and the exuberance of actually creating art and putting it out for the world to see. While the Black Dog are no stranger to dark and introspective themes, I think this is the most vividly personal any of them have gotten. Martin Dust says, "Some of us are made other, and all you need to do is find your like me," which doesn't even necessarily need to be another person. Sometimes there can be comfort found just in the knowledge that others out there can relate to your experience, and this album is meant to hopefully deliver that. So yeah, I do really like the message and theming behind this whole project. Now as for the content of the music itself, well, it's a Black Dog album. If you've been familiar with literally any of their output for the past almost 20 years now, since Martin and Richard Dust joined the group in the mid-2000s, you should already have a pretty good idea on what to expect. Lots of very straightforward and stripped-back techno formulas with an especially dark and brooding tone, and some occasional more chilling ambient pieces to break up the sound of the project a bit. There's really nothing here they haven't done before plenty of times in the past. Now, that's all well and good. I'm always game for another album that just sticks to the usual Black Dog techno style so long as the formula continues to be executed well. My Brutal Life wasn't anything new for them either, but they did manage to hit on a particular execution of that formula that happened to resonate with me more than any other projects of theirs had in years. Other Like Me, meanwhile, is not quite as much of a standout in the grander scheme of their catalog. In terms of my actual enjoyment, it's about average in the grander scheme of their material over the last 8 years or so. So, no, it's not one of their absolute best, but still an all-around good time. I think it hit, for me, on about the same level as their other recent albums like Music for Airport Lounges and The Grey Album did. I think I slightly prefer The Grey Album over this. That one had better tunes, was a bit more consistent, and even if the flatter analog approach to that album's production was less to my personal taste, it did still make for a more interesting sonic identity that allowed it to stand out from the rest of their catalog more easily. But they're about equally on par with each other enjoyment-wise, and I do personally prefer the production style on this one. In terms of the individual tracks here, there are definitely moments I like on this thing more than others. I do think the album starts out decently strong with the first handful of tracks. The opener, She Never Wrote Back, may not be a huge standout for me and falls into the background more often than I'd like to admit, but it does have a particularly cinematic, partially ambient mix with brooding pads and simultaneously light and heavy percussion tapping around them. Makes for a decently dramatic start to this thing, and from there the heavier techno grooves start to come into play more as we get tracks like With You I Still Feel Alone, which has a slightly faster and more foot-tapping groove to it, or Dressed Up Ausla, which kinda carries off the previous track's idea and adds some brighter but tired-sounding melodic arpeggios, which I think are quite nice. Both of those are definite highlights for me. After that, there's a run of 4 somewhat interconnected tracks that kinda stomp away at the same tempo. You got Crash, which is possibly the heaviest track on the album with a big stomping kick that just plods away. One of the more easily recognizable ideas here. Leading into Just Pretend to Be Someone Else and I'm Poster Syndrome. Which kind of carry off similar ideas in a less distinct way and might have more buzzing synth textures or airy, reverby pads respectively. Although the latter track leads into Bubble Life, which is basically the exact same track with some warmer and brighter melodies added on top. Not unlike the moment in Radio Scarecrow where the track Beep transitioned into the track Witches of. That's a really solid moment there. I will say that I am left wishing more tracks on this thing, flowed just a little more tightly together, like that particular segue from I'm Poster Syndrome into Bubble Life. There's more tracks here that have very brief pauses between them that might leave me feeling it's a bit of a missed opportunity to have these tracks that otherwise feel like natural continuations of each other be able to pick up on the same beat the previous one left off on, like what they always used to do so easily on old albums like Radio Scarecrow. On the other hand, they've also had albums that didn't even try to flow as well as this one already does. See old projects like Fragments or Tranquilments. And the continuous mix here does still flow well enough where this point still feels more of a minor nitpick than anything. Anyway, Bubble Life is also the start of a short 3-track run, which is pretty easily my favorite part of the album. For Real is all ambient, but its chilling pads feel surprisingly pleasant and optimistic, and that leads into possibly my favorite track here, Closed Eyes, which combines similar melodic pads stripped back to a much airier texture and some lighter ambient techno grooves that are built on top of it that vaguely reminds me of the recent Music track Lime Arrow. This little run of 3 tracks feels like something of a comforting oasis in an otherwise very dark and brooding experience that otherwise tends to lean more away from the melodies. And of course, from that point on, we just go back right into all that dark, brooding moodiness for pretty much the entire rest of the album. Now from there, this whole last third to almost half of the album does get a little hit and miss for me. Cuts here like the title track or Methodology number 17 can end up blending more in the background for me. A few cuts such as In a Place Like This or Markup have some more easily recognizable and heavier techno grooves to them, but for whatever reason kind of get diminishing returns the more frequently I put the album on. I guess at that point the unpleasant mood of everything was starting to wear out on me ever so slightly, but I don't know. On the other hand, there are 2 solid standouts right next to them that hit basically the exact same note in a way that I was able to get into more easily. The heavier kicks and metallic patterns on Boy on a Swing are almost kind of catchy and form something of a loose hook that stands out from the crowd. And then they transition quite effectively into the more IDM-flavored tapping percussion workouts on I Have a Keen Interest. So yeah, I really like those 2, though. Those are highlights. And the album ends with a 6.5-minute, mostly ambient cut called I Am an Artist, which I admittedly have somewhat mixed feelings on. On one hand, the ambience created by this track is quite refreshing. Feels like you're finally taking a breath of fresh air at the end of all these dark negative thoughts being explored by other tracks leading up to it. Ending on a comparatively optimistic note that leaves you with less of a feeling of bleakness than you might typically expect out of a Black Dog album, and that's very nice. On the other hand, I did feel like this track might have run on just a bit too long for its own good. 6.5 minutes, that doesn't seem like much, and I don't mind sitting in that more meditative space for longer, but it is easily the longest track on the album. The second longest is only about 4 minutes, and most tracks here average around 2 to 3.5 minutes. That difference in length and pacing between the closer and everything else on the album is noticeable, and it leads to me feeling like the track could have naturally ended about 2 minutes earlier than it needed to for the pacing to feel more natural. Still a nice way to go out, if not a favorite. So yeah, that's everything on Other Like Me. It's an all-around solid album, another worthy addition to a remarkably solid catalog they've been building out for such a long time. Even all the tracks I've marked as not being particular favorites all have at least something cool to deliver in their particular style without being skips. Although as a whole, this is maybe one that I like more for what it's meant to represent and the messaging behind it than the actual listening experience, which isn't one of their more consistent outings in recent memory. I mean, with this being the 19th studio album under their belt and so many other projects I've really enjoyed that they've put out over so many years, it does become difficult for an album like this to really stand out for them as much as I'd like. Especially with how many Black Dog albums we've just gotten over the past year and a half. We have not had any shortage of quality material from them. But even if this isn't one of their best, again, it isn't one of their worst either. It adds on to that string of quality. I probably enjoyed this more than music for airport lounges, which, despite a particularly unique concept, could occasionally feel like more of a side offering that didn't have as much substance to it. In any case, if you've been enjoying any of the Black Dog's other more recent material, Other Like Me is going to be as worth hearing as anything else they've done lately. It's still quite good and lives up to my baseline expectations of what I'd want a new Black Dog album to deliver, even if it doesn't exceed them. And as such, I think I'm feeling a 7.3 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.